Disclaimer. This video contains spoilers for The Stories of Sodor, Stories of War, and the SCPs of Sodor by Victor Tanzig. Parts of this video may be distressing for some viewers. Viewers' discretion is therefore advised. Now, you've all probably seen this original video of this, which, by the way, thank you everyone. I did not expect that high of a turnout when I made that original video. But anyways, let me clarify. This is indeed the same video, just more a remastered version of it, because I will admit that the original timeline video is not the greatest at all. But I have learned more stuff with editing, so let's give it another chance, shall we? And also to add Season 6, because relevancy. So, the script for this video will likely sound very familiar in some places, but I won't sound so cold sounding voice that I had back then, because let's hopefully it sounds better. Hopefully, please. We know generally when the series ends, most likely in 2015, as we see Edward tell the stories of Sodor to the engines on the Brendan branch line and other places. But Victor Tanzig has not finished the series just yet, with at the time of recording currently in late 1968. There are 6 seasons ranging from roughly 1934 to 1968, with a 7th season obviously in the works. We have 2 specials and technically 2 spin-off series to cover, so in total with everything that we have roughly 97 episodes worth of content. There are of course lore dumps mentioned throughout the series, as well as the years that the events take place, so I've arranged them all into linear order to better understand events for later seasons. So things that may appear in, let's say, 1942 may not appear relevant, but will appear a lot relevant in like the mid-60s. Also, quick side note, the SCPs of Sodor may not be canon to some people, but it is open-ended enough that I feel like it can work and fit within the main series, so I will be including the events that take place, but I'll mark them with asterisks and to show that it may not be canon to some people in its own separate segment. With all that out of the way, sit back with a drink or food. This is going to be a long one. I now present the Stories of Sodor timeline, spanning from the early years to 1968, with a few sprinklings from 2015 thrown in for good measure. Also, some of these years are kind of headcanon explanations, as specific dates aren't mentioned with some of the events that happen in flashbacks. Our story starts in 1856 with the formation of the Sodor and Mainland Railway. In a workshop in Glasgow during the same year, the first recorded non-faceless engine was built. His name was Clive. Neil and Matthew were built soon after, being shipped to Sodor in the same year. The S&M from Vickerstown to Crovan's Gate was completed in December 1857. We experience quite a big time jump here, for in 1879 we see the construction of the Harwick tramway on the north of Sodor, hoping to connect the various towns around Harwick to the harbour itself. Toby was built and purchased during this time to help run the line. In 1882, construction of the Mid-Sodor Railway from King Ori's Bridge started, and Duke was built and purchased for the line, being delivered literally in parts by horse and cart. Also in 1882, the S&M reached Marin, following the construction of the viaduct. However, the finances of the S&M became low at this point, with the S&M struggling on for the next 30ish years. In 1884, the slate mine on the MSR opened, leading the MSR to purchase another engine. This engine would be a small industrial engine called Atlas, who also helped out with the goods work on the line. Also in 1884, the Crovan's Gate Railway Company was formed, primarily to ship ballast from the hills to the ever-expanding S&M. Skarloey and Rheneas were purchased in the same year. In 1885, the Crovan's Gate Railway reached the town of Boxford, establishing the main ballast plant in the same year. Also in 1885, the Wellsworth and Sudbury Railway was formed, with the construction of Wellsworth Station in 1886. Adam, Lily and Colin were purchased for the line, extending the line down the Brendan Peninsula, stopping at Sudbury and at Brendan itself, building the docks. The S&M would also build the line over Gordon's Hill, known then as the Preston Incline, named after Nathaniel Preston, the owner of the WNS. In 1887, there was a huge storm on the island, causing flash flooding in the ballast quarry on the GCR, trapping workmen on top of buildings and huts. Skarloey was sent to rescue them, charging through the floodwaters to rescue the workmen, at great risk to his own safety as the cold water made contact with his very hot firebox. The name change to the Skarloey Railway following his heroism was undertaken in 1888, giving it the name that we are all familiar with today. In 1891, Edward was built to haul passenger trains on the Furness Railway on the mainland. In 1896, Edward on the Furness Railway would be momentarily transferred to a western part of the line, While he was there, he met Samson, mocking him for being an industrial engine only. But, while he was on his transfer detail, Edward took a long line of steel rails down the line, forgetting about the steep hill, quickly becoming a runaway. Samson was nearby, and with his strong power, was able to save Edward. Approximately in 1901, Wyeth was sent to South Africa to help with the Second Boer War, meeting and talking with Winston Churchill and Mahatma Gandhi. One day, the train of diamonds he was carrying was robbed by bandits, the diamonds never being found again, except they were found again, but that is for much later. In 1902, the WNS expanded to Crosby, building the station on the main line. In 1903, the Crovensgate workshops opened, quickly getting a reputation for an excellent standard of work, able to fix and repair any engine. Kyle Harrigan was one of the main businessmen financing the Harwick Tramway, whose wife Henrietta was fond of the railway. Henrietta was Spanish, teaching Toby a decent number of the Spanish language during his time on the Harwick Tramway. In 1903, tragically Henrietta would die from influenza. This led Kyle to neglect the railway, eventually leading to its closure in 1904. But in 1904 the Elsbridge and Knapford Railway was formed, being able to take up the opportunity to purchase Toby on the cheap. He was shipped from Harwick to Brendam, encountering animosity from the WNS crew. Following the closure of the Harwick Tramway, the MSR bought the land, using the land to expand the MSR. Stewart and Falcon were purchased and arrived to the line in 1904. In 1905, Toby helped expand the line from Crosby to Elsbridge. The E&K needed another engine, so commissioned the Crovensgate workshop to build another engine, an engine you may all be familiar with. His name was Thomas. From the lowlands, Stewart and Falcon built the line, and from the hills, Duke and Atlas expanded the line, both ends meeting at Islesdale in 1906. In 1907, the Furness Railway began to decline. The Furness Railway itself had been operating since 1844. Edward, Winston and Albert were the only non-faceless engines on the line, with the exception of Samson, but he's a privately owned engine on an industrial line, so he doesn't really count under the umbrella. Anyways, an opportunity to expand the Furness Railway was proposed, but unfortunately, while the investors were on the Furness Railway, a few accidents happened. The most serious accident involved the collapse of a rail crane onto a stack of dynamite, destroying a decent part of Dalton Yard. The investors were scared off by the incident that had happened, causing the Furness Railway to file for bankruptcy in October 1907. Albert went to work for the LBSCR, and Winston went to work at the Great Eastern Railway. In 1907, the E&K extended to Knapford, therefore purchasing Edward for passenger earning service the same year. In 1910, Railgate Prison was built, designed to hold non-faceless vehicles for a maximum of 30 days, or 15 years for a certain engine, as any more than 30 days would have a massive impact on a railway if the engine was in prison, unable to perform the duty of hauling revenue-earning trains. Also in 1910, Ivo Hugh joined the SKR, helping to expand the line for 3 years to the various towns and villages along the river, causing the SKR to become a fully fledged railway in 1913. Wilbert Audrey was born in 1911, eventually becoming a clergyman. You may have heard of him. And yes, I said born this time. I am aware of my gaffe on the original video. Yes, okay, move on. In 1914, the S&M filed for bankruptcy, and Neil, Clive and Matthew were momentarily leased to a joint railway effort, and considering the year they were currently in, I'm pretty sure you can guess what was currently happening. World War II started in 1914, which was obviously a very bad thing, but it did have some momentary good for Sodor. The main line was to be extended through Tidmouth all the way to Islesborough on the northwestern side of Sodor for defensive purposes, but that would take a few years to be completed. In 1915, the WNS would finish the construction of the China clay pits near Brendam. Also in 1915, a new rail line would be constructed from Lower Knapford to Knapford, with a tunnel through the hills called Ballyhoo Tunnel, later renamed Henry's Tunnel. The previous line from Elsbridge to Knapford would become the Loop Line, an alternate route of trains derailed on the main line. Farmer McCall's farm is located on this loop line. In 1915 as well, due to signalman error, Edward was on the same line as Adam, carrying a fully loaded passenger train. Brian the brake van decided bravely to stay on the line, intending to slow and stop Edward. Edward stops just in front of the barber shop, but the barber was not impressed. He almost lathered Brian and Edward's faces with shaving cream when Jackson Bailey intervened, calming the barber and explaining the situation. This is our first mention of Jackson Bailey, and trust me, you'll hear his name a lot more as we progress through this video. In 1916, the Knapford Harbour was constructed, with the purchase of 10 cents and Roland to help with general manoeuvres. During the construction, one of the quays was built on unstable platforms, leading to its sinking into the harbour. Following the completion of the Knapford Harbour, Drolan was sent to be a general tugboat for the Brendam Harbour, while 10 Cents stayed at Knapford. On the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway during this time, James and his partner Amanda were working with munitions until one day James accidentally bumped a railgun that had a live round in it. The round would hit explosives, killing Amanda and heavily damaging James. James would always have PTSD whenever he saw railguns and any heavy equipment related to it. In the USA in 1917, Stanley was built by the Baldwin Locomotive Works, being shipped overseas to the front line in France. Also in 1917, the lumber mill at Carlton was built, as well as the coal mine at Marston Heights and the start of the Farquhar branch line. The Farquhar branch line itself was mainly built by WIF during this year, a governmentally owned engine. At Mont-Saint-Beer in France, the British fort came under attack, and a lieutenant, a 24-year-old Topham Hatt, who was a guard on Stanley's train that day, ran to a nearby gun emplacement, defending against the Germans for over an hour. Topham would be sent home on medical leave, as he had PTSD from this event. The ship that he was on, the Lady Rose, would be torpedoed in a storm while it's on its way to Sodor from France. The sole survivor, Topham Hatt again, would signal a passing freighter with a lamp that had been aboard. Topham Hatt would hold on to this lamp until he was sent to the hospital at Carlton. While on his way there, the lamp fell out of the coach after the train crossed over a dodgy crossing. Wesley Anderson was the main man who ran the Carlton Hospital, notoriously running experiments on some of the soldiers to test ways to overcome mental illnesses, practices that were shortly banned after the war. Topham Hatt would be at the hospital till the end of the war, being experimented on himself to get over the loss of the lamp that had saved his life and the PTSD he had received at Mont-Saint-Beer. A bunch of dynamite was stolen the day before from a workman's hut along the extension to Islesborough. Some German spies had snuck onto Sodor, intending to blow up Knapford Harbour. This plot was foiled when a nearby truck saw the exchange happen, alerting the authorities. The lorry that was transporting the dynamite took off in a hurry, having to swerve around a lamp that had been placed onto the main line, crashing into a wall as a result. None of the engines knew where the lamp had come from, dubbing it the Lucky Lamp as it allowed the capture of the German spies. The Lucky Lamp would pass around the various railways on Sodor, always seeming to appear at the right time. The Farquhar branch line would open for revenue-earning service in 1918. The standard gauge railway would reach Islesborough as well in 1918, creating a through traffic route for the MSR to the NWR. And finally, World War I would end in November of 1918. Towards the end of 1918, after the war had ended, Neil was sent to work at the China clay pits, and Matthew went to work at the lumber mill. Clive helped to extend the Farquhar branch line up to Anofa to form a new stone quarry, which he then ended up working at. In 1919, WIF was sent back to Barrow, helping to build the shunting yards and scrapping facilities. WIF was then assigned as the Barrow Station pilot. In 1919, Henry was built from stolen designs from Sir Nigel Gresley, having too small of a firebox. Andreas was purchased in 1920 to work on the MSR as its designated express engine. In 1921, the Railway Act was passed, grouping all the out-of-control railways of Britain into 4 individual groups. They were as follows: the London and North Eastern Railway, the London, Midland and Scottish Railway, the Great Western Railway, and the Southern Railway. The Vickerstown Lift Bridge would be built towards the end of 1921, the same year that Mr. Starr and Mr. Zorro joined the railways. The E&K and the WNS were grouped into the LNER and LMS respectively in approximately 1922. The LNER crew were nicknamed the Nor'easters, while the LMS crew were nicknamed the Middies, but I'll just call them by their actual names just for simplicity. In 1923, Gordon arrived on Sodor for the LNER, as well as Arthur and Douglas for the LMS. But tragically, in the winter of 1923, Arthur would die in an accident where he was trying to make up for lost time on a delayed passenger train. In doing so, he crashed at the base of Gordon's Hill. His spirit is said to haunt the railway whenever someone tells his tale, always trying to reach his final destination on time. Following the death of Arthur, Donald was brought to Sodor for the LMS. Mickey was also brought to Sodor, becoming the designated fire and rescue engine for the next roughly 40 years. In 1924, Reginald arrived on Sodor for the LMS as well as James and Henry for the LNER. In 1925, Patrick Clifton, a former workman for the Sodor and Mainland Railway, now turned postman, was walking next to a train in a lumber yard when Matthew had back onto the train. Some of the logs had been improperly loaded, and so some of the logs would crush and kill Patrick. Matthew would suppress these memories for the next 40 odd years. In 1926, Knapford Station was upgraded from 2 platforms to 5, with a through line on the 6th rail line. In 1928, Douglas was purchased for the SKR from the Barnhill Railway, following the closure of the latter one due to very dodgy practices. In 1929, the stock market on Wall Street tumbled, causing the Great Depression worldwide. While the UK didn't suffer as dreadfully as the USA, everything became quite a little bit tight, notably on the railways. Soon, the Big Four were effectively fighting for contracts for certain trains and construction projects, hoping to get by in the trying times. Also in 1929, the fuel depot at Lower Knapford was built. In 1929, Henry was given the chance to try and pull the express. Needless to say, there's a reason why he mainly does goods work. In 1930, the Tidmouth Dairy at Tidmouth was built. In 1931, Bruce was built by Walter Paxman, an experimental locomotive powered by a diesel engine, different to the traditional steam engine. Doug and Bruce would work on a branch line shared by the LMS and GWR, as Bruce learned the ropes of shunting. Bruce would rule the yard with an iron fist whenever Duck was out of earshot. Following a few incidents, one of these involving a truck being smashed down a hill, and Bruce's engine failing, his iron grip began to slip. It then got to a point where the truck sang a song teasing Diesel about being a diesel, simply just calling him Diesel. The name soon stuck, and that's what I'm basically going to call him for the rest of this video. Diesel would be purchased for LMS operations on Sodor, becoming the only diesel engine on Sodor for many years. In 1933, an outbreak of mad cow disease caused Joey to come to Sodor, being tasked with ensuring no infected cattle would be transported to market. And now we have finally come to the main part of the series itself, covering the events from 1934 to 1965, which is very vast in terms of content. So I'll try and condense down the episodes, but it will take a while. I'll just mark events of significance, or at least those that I deem to be significant. Some of the years are unknown specifically, but so I will be guessing in some cases just based upon historical and general hints in the episodes themselves. In 1934, Percy would arrive for the LNER, becoming the shunter at Knapford Station. Within his first week, Percy had a few troubles around the Duchess contract. Due to the context of the Great Depression, the LNER and LMS basically fought each other for the contracts and revenue from companies upon successful completion. Thomas, James, and Percy were the only engines available to pull the Duchess contract for the LNER, but with meddling from Diesel throwing Colleen the truck into the back of Percy, the contract was given to the LMS. But Percy thought he was to blame, but Doug, who had been from the GWR visiting, had seen this whole thing play out, thereby acquitting Percy of any wrongdoing, and so Percy was allowed to stay with the LNER. Diesel would get 15 days in Railgate for throwing Colleen into Percy. Which, by the way, if someone in the comments can tell me how many days Diesel spends in Railgate or just in prison in general, let me know. I think it might actually be 100. The British Union of Fascists would be formed in 1934, dedicated to spreading the fascist ideals of the then newly elected Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. I don't think anyone will know about him. I think he'll just be a politician that passes out of the way. Roughly 6 months after Percy arrived on Sodor, Mr. Starr decided that Percy was capable enough to be shown how the Far Cry branch line operated, with Thomas taking him up the line to show Percy all the sides. A huge stone order from a Nova quarry had to go out that day, so Thomas and Percy alternated taking stone trains to Elsbridge to be transferred to Henry's train. On the final train, Thomas would be stopped and almost arrested by a policeman under the rules that an engine must have side plates, you know, all that kind of rubbish BS, but as it turns out, this rubbish BS was based upon regulations that had been out of date for a few years. But this whole fiasco would not stop all the engines of the LNER and LMS getting the rulebook read to them, albeit from a guy that, as is described, had the charisma of a wet blanket. A few weeks later, Edward and Duke would be having a discussion about Amelia Earhart, the famous woman aviator, while Edward got his train loaded with slate and other goods. Stewart's train was delayed, but Edward had to leave without him to keep to the timetable of the ship at Knapford Harbour. Adam, who had been shunting at Islesborough, decided to take the opportunity when Stewart finally arrived and took his load, effectively earning the contract for the LMS and not the LNER. Percy had been sent to collect the train from Knapford, stopping Adam under Article 219 of the Fair Transport Act. A policeman was nearby and raised the alarm, stopping Adam and causing a whole debate about whether Adam stole the train or was doing the LNER a favour. Percy, as a consequence of this, was given the train itself, delivering it to Knapford Harbour so the ship could set sail. We are still in 1934 of the construction of the Elsbridge Harbour under the Sodor construction scheme, aimed at getting jobs for people during the Great Depression. At the yard in Carlton, the turntable jammed, causing James to be delayed with a train for the Elsbridge Harbour. When he was finally allowed to get to his train, he stood off as fast as he could, tearing down the line as fast as he could as well. One of the axle boxes on one of the trucks began to overheat and spark, causing a fire to be started next to Henry's tunnel, causing a fire that damaged the power grid and the field next to the line, causing the LNER to cover the cost of the repairs. Wellsworth Yard was also upgraded under the Sodor construction scheme. When Diesel and Colin delivered a train to the yard, a stray spark from Colin caused some trucks of coal to catch alight. The fire soon spread to other trucks in the yard. A workman had been left behind, so Thomas, who was on the scene, bravely decided to go in and rescue him. Unfortunately for him, his safety valve burst at this moment, grinding him to a standstill. Fortunately for Thomas, Colin was able to save Thomas, allowing both of them to escape the yard so Mickey could extinguish the fire. I'm going to place an incident involving Alfred and Geoffrey here in 1935 to give some variety. Alfred was scheduled to take a very important train for the Duke and Duchess of Boxford, but due to a convenient placement of a faulty truck, Alfred was stuck in his shed. Spencer was nearby, however, and was put onto the train, being purchased by the Duke and Duchess as their own private engine. Needless to say, this incident caused some animosity between Alfred and Geoffrey. In the autumn of 1936, the L&Er's Express would suffer a few incidents with Gordon and James. Gordon would break down on the Preston Incline, and James's train would suffer a leaky brake pipe, having to be fixed with bootlaces and newspaper. The Preston Incline was therefore renamed to Gordon's Hill, for he had the honour of being the first engine to break down on it. There's a minor discrepancy with the timeline, as Victor states that Eric and Peter were purchased in 1935 for the L&R and LMS, but their introductory story takes place in 1936. So let's just say it's 1936 here. Well, I'm going to put in 1935 here, but say 1936 just so everything makes sense. Following the incidents with the L&R Express, passenger numbers were at an all-time low, but goods traffic continued to climb. Henry was a valuable asset for the L&R fleet, as he could pull trains that the LMS had to double or triple head. He was the strongest engine on the island, until Peter arrived in 1936 for the LMS. Peter was stronger than Henry, turning the goods contracts one by one to the LMS from the L&R. One day, Edward accidentally took on bad water, struggling to pull his trains. He just about gave up at Wellsworth when Peter arrived in the yard. Shockingly, Peter offered to help Edward up the hill behind his train, doing so with incredible ease. A reporter for the local paper was on Edward's train, publishing an article about the incident. The wording of the article had caused more contracts to turn back to the L&R, resulting in Eric to be purchased for the L&R. Eric's design allowed him to pull trains just as long as Henry's, turning the tide back again to the L&R. We are still in 1936 with Eric being a valuable member for the L&R. However, he did have a habit of forgetting trains or taking the wrong trains entirely. The Elsbridge Harbour was completed around this time, intending to be expanded further. Eric was therefore put in charge of this project. One day, Eric would deliver a long train to Elsbridge. He decided to help Edward with shunting in the yard as he was early. Unfortunately, he left his stone train on the main line. Eric realised his mistake too late, just barely pulling the train off the main line as Henry passed through, heavily braking. Because of this heavy braking, his wheels became grounded, resulting in Henry being unable to move. Edward was put onto the Elsbridge Harbour project as a result, and Eric was put on permanent warning. One small mess up and he would have been sent away for good. At Brendam, a small shipment of china clay was being fulfilled. However, one day, Diesel accidentally pushed the whole train into the ocean, washing away all the valuable china clay. With the wedding of Mrs. Kindley's daughter in September 1936 fast approaching, the Reverend Wilbur Audrey arrived on Sodor for the first time to officiate the wedding. We have now reached 1937, with an influx of Spanish refugees from the Spanish Civil War, an uprising intending to overthrow the government. A ship full of refugees arrived at Brendam Harbour, causing quite a bit of disarray as no one could exactly understand the Spanish. Because Toby is able to speak Spanish, he was sent to Brendam Harbour and was able to translate and help the immigrants. The immigrants began to sail across Sodor, becoming integrated in the general Sudric society. One day on Thomas's train, however, one of the pregnant immigrants went into labour. Needless to say, Thomas took off fast, intending to reach Elsbridge where an ambulance would take the passenger off to the hospital. Thomas had been rushing so fast that he burst his safety valve. Luckily for all parties involved, Eric was nearby and was able to pull the broken down Thomas to Elsbridge. Station Master Jeffries, however, had sent away the ambulance before they arrived, causing the baby to be born at Elsbridge Station, being named Thomas Eric Galindus in honour of the two engines who had helped with the situation. Thomas Galindus would eventually rise through the ranks of the railway, becoming Edward's driver. After Eric's performance with helping Thomas, Mr. Starr took Eric off permanent warning and put him in charge of the Knapford Harbour Extension project. At the Tory Wreck mines, Thomas accidentally fell into the mine shaft as the danger board had been moved by some practical joker. One day, Lily was taking a train of scrap to the Barrow scrapyards, but one of the trucks hadn't been tied down properly. The pipe struck the corner of the bridge at Crovan's Gate, and because of the broken down bus above, the bridge began to sag. Unfortunately, regional was expected to come through under the bridge at any given moment, so with quick thinking from Scarlowy, Gordon and Lily put their trucks under the bridge enough to support it as regional passed through. Needless to say, a new bridge was put in place. The contract going to the L&R for the LMS had effectively brought down the bridge. The winter of 1937 was very strong, with lots of ice and snow being on Sodor. Donald and Douglas, who were from Scotland, excelled at clearing the snowdrifts, as apparently the drifts in Scotland could be at least 30 feet deep, 10 metres deep for the Brits. Late one night, Edward tells the story of Arthur to the engines, Thomas believing that Arthur's ghost does indeed exist due to the various reported sightings across the years. Kate would be purchased for the coal mines and Marston Heights, as the previous arrangement had been a free-for-all amongst the other engines, being very inefficient indeed. Over the coming days, the engines began to report sightings of Arthur's ghost. Strangely an E2 engine as opposed to the 2MT that Arthur was, but let's not worry about that right now. Tragically one night, however, Arthur's ghost arrived at Marin Station. One unfortunate lady happened to look inside one of the coaches, going insane from the sight she saw. Mr. Zorro was brought in to deal with the ghost, as the theory was that Arthur had always listened to Mr. Zorro, and so with his help, Arthur's ghost disappeared for good. We now reach the year of 1938, a major year for Sodor indeed. All of the snow had melted, which had caused business to increase rapidly, causing the engines to be rushed off their wheels. Alfred was momentarily loaned as the express engine so Gordon could help with the goods work. Gordon and Henry encountered a cow on the bridge just outside of Crosby. That wouldn't be the only incident involving cows, however, for Edward would be pulling a goods train one day, when some cows broke through a fence and onto the line, damaging the couplings between some of the trucks. On Gordon's Hill, these trucks would then break away, sailing down the hill and crashing into Adam. A few weeks later, Thumper the Bull escaped his field, wandering down the loop line. Diesel went to stop the bull, only to be scared away himself. Unfortunately for Diesel, Toby saw the whole incident, reporting on his misfortunes to the rest of the LNER fleet naturally. An outbreak of foot and mouth disease in the cattle on Sodor caused quite a number of cattle trains to be quarantined, being guarded by a customs officer waving a red flag. Jerry would be brought to Sodor once again to randomly spot check the trains. During this time, Burke and Blair were on Sodor, monitoring the engines and suggesting edits and improvements that Mr. Starr should make. The pair proposed to sell Toby as he was getting very old. Toby's boiler was indeed quite old at this point, acting up quite a lot. Percy went to go and collect a cattle train from Farmer McCall's farm, stopping when he saw a red flag waving man. Rather oddly, however, Percy would see Farmer McCall walk up to the man, hand him something, and then the red flag waving man walked away. Percy was suspicious of this, telling some of the engines at the yard. Diesel heard about this and took the opportunity and went for it, and in the ensuing commotion, Toby's boiler kicked it, spewing black smoke everywhere. Against Burke and Blair's orders, Mr. Starr ordered a full rebuild of Toby's boiler. Though he found out about McCall's bribery, arresting him. Diesel was momentarily detained during this time, as he was found to be effectively grabbing a train that should not have been grabbed in the first place. On the MSR, Andreas would be taking a passenger train to the top station when Burke put out a cigarette in one of the coaches, causing quite a lot of pain to the coach in question. Andreas wished him because of what he did to that coach. Burke had been having an affair during his time on Sodor, which was found out due to some trucks leaking the story. Needless to say, Burke lost his job and his wife following the incident, but this would not be the last time we would see of Burke or Blair. Douglas was having some troubles with a rather spiteful brakeman named Dominic, who would always give trouble for either Donald or Douglas. Donald would be given 7 days incarceration for bumping Dominic one day at Brendam Docks. One day, when Douglas was helping James up Gordon's Hill, he pushed too hard and Dominic was therefore destroyed, killing him, but like Burke and Blair, this would not be the last time we would see Dominic. Scott, formerly Flying Scotsman, would come to Sodor to help with odd jobs for the LNER, but because we can't have an engine imbalance, the LNER got their turn as well. Jeffrey would therefore come to Sodor to help with the work for the LMS, creating yet another rivalry. Seriously, there's like 5 different rivalries going on, why can't they just all live in peace, please? Jeffrey would of course bring trouble to Sodor with a spate of Axhall hotboxes befalling the LNER trains, causing delays for the LNER. Joey would connect the incidents and realise that the LMS was behind the incidents, but not who specifically was doing it, so he launched a sting operation, using Colleen the truck and Diesel to effectively arrest Jeffrey. Colleen would fall for a simple ruse, which then led to her giving up Diesel for what he did back in 1934 to Percy, which then led on to the events surrounding Jeffrey. Jeffrey would be shunted away for the maximum 30 days, being reassigned to other parts of the LMS for a good long while, but this would not be the last time we would see of the Red Engine. Stanley would be purchased in 1938 to help with the expanding goods services on the MSR, but quite a few incidents happened when he was on there. First, Stewart derailed on the points at Lower Aylesbury, and then the cranes called to pull Stewart back onto the line both failed. Stanley was then tasked with pulling Stewart back onto the line, which he did so with incredible ease, due to Stanley's design being American. USA, USA, USA. Later that day, Falcon and Stanley took the train up to the top of the line, with Falcon coming off the line up on the mountain road. But with Stanley's help, Falcon was able to be re-railed. A few days later, Stewart was up at the slate quarry when the slate trucks ran away on the incline, crashing into Stewart and damaging his funnel. Falcon had a theory at this time that all of the incidents were tied in with Stewart blowing his whistle, so one day they decided to test this theory. After getting Stewart to blow his whistle in the presence of Stanley, a box arrived, but it was a pipe and not Stewart's funnel. It appeared then that Stanley was indeed jinxed, but there was something that could help the MSR crew. That, of course, was the lucky lamp, being transferred from the Skarloey Railway to the MSR. Toby then told the story of how the lamp was first found with the sabotage attempt at Knapford Harbour in 1917. And with that, Season 1 is completed, spanning 1934 to mid-1938. But oh boy, does it get even more richer in content as we go along. I'd give this first season maybe a good solid 7 out of 5 out of 10, a great start for a series like this back in 2017. This is what the individual ranking looks like so far. Continuing on to Season 2, we are still in 1938 with the arrival of Montgomery to Sodor. Gordon was not pleased, for he was annoyed with the fact that Montgomery had supposedly gone 100 miles per hour in 1904, which was unverified at the time. Gordon's brother Scott had of course achieved 100 miles per hour in 1931, so that was where the argument was coming from. A remark about Montgomery not having a dome was mentioned by Gordon in passing. Coincidentally, the next day a loose brick from the bridge struck Gordon on his dome, so when he got to the viaduct, a teasing wind scooped down to Gordon's dome and took it clean right off and into the river below, disappearing under the mud and rocks. While Gordon was in the works, Ellis was brought to Sodor to be the temporary express engine. Inspection by a member of the railway board was undertaken on Sodor. This inspection thought to be an inspection about which railway would get the boot from Sodor, the LNER or the LMS. The inspector is a man that you should all know by now. This man was Sir Topham Hatt. During the inspection, Sir Topham Hatt ended up at the MSR, encountering Stanley, who he had served with in France during World War I. While Sir Topham Hatt was at Islesborough, however, Adam would then lose control of a fully laden tar wagon which careened out of the yard and into James, derailing and covering him in tar. A few days later, when Percy was trying to play a trick on the new branch line coaches, who were incredibly snooty, he ran into a luggage trolley, spilling jam everywhere and ending up with Sir Topham's trousers atop his funnel. Sir Topham Hatt was not impressed at all. He was going to have to make his decision about who was going to get the boot from Sodor, when a very serious incident changed all of this. An engine called Wendell came to Sodor, stealing trainloads of goods to take to a group of lorries, who had William hostage over unpaid debts with Wendell. Which, how does that really work? How does an engine kind of give money in that? Oh, let's not worry about that. With the help of Whiff, Lily and Thomas, Wendell was able to stop the 3 lorries, allowing Joey and the police to arrest the lorries. But due to the fact that Wendell had indeed been stealing in the first place, no matter the fact that Wendell was being blackmailed, Wendell was sent to a railgate for 15 days. This whole affair showed to Sir Topham Hatt what the engines of Sodor could do together, so he allowed both railways to stay on Sodor indefinitely. The boulder atop the hill just outside of Crosby was a major tourist site, with people flocking to the site to marvel at this strange circular boulder, very much unlike most other boulders in shape. One week in 1938, the rain came down hard, so much rain came down in fact, that the boulder began to move. It rolled onto the main line, almost squashed Diesel and Colton who were passing by the area. Needless to say, the boulder blocking the main line would cause many delays. Following an attempt to clear the boulder using Henry and Gordon, Billy Shoepack from the Franks and Sons munition factory was brought up for assistance. Billy was a specialist in dynamite, so decided to blow up the boulder, which gave very obvious results. The main line would be destroyed, but luckily it was rebuilt, after a few days or weeks of course. At Knapford Harbour during September 1938, the dog workers went on strike, causing a great deal of chaos for the LNER crew. Due to Knapford Harbour being closed, all ships were redirected to Brendam Harbour, causing so many trains in such a small area that some of the LNER crew had to then leave from effectively Knapford Harbour and go work with the LMS at Brendam Harbour. This arrangement was satisfactory for about a week or so, until tensions began to rise. One night while Duck was on Sodor, he decided to help Henry up Gordon's Hill, not knowing that the brake van was very old. When the train began to climb, all of Duck's weight transferred to the brake van, destroying it. Little did anyone know that the brake van's destruction would awake a certain entity. The tensions at Brendam all boiled to a point that Henry, Gordon, and James all went on strike, protesting the conditions that they were working in, with abuse from the LMS crew constant. Mr. Starr was able to convince Henry, Gordon, and James to go back to Brendan, apologising for comments that he had said the previous night about potentially scrapping all of them. A few incidents involving goods trains would take place in November 1938, the first of which involved Lily's train breaking in half and the brake van disappearing suddenly, accompanied by a weird howling noise. The brake van and the guard, Richard Payton, were found in the vicarage orchard, the brake van destroyed and Richard a charred skeleton. Clearly something supernatural must to have been able to perform an act like this. A few days after the funeral for Richard, another accident would occur. James's train split in half just on Wellsworth Junction, with an unlucky Peter coming down Gordon's Hill at the time, who, being unable to stop in time, ploughed straight into James's train, causing enough damage to send Peter to the works for a good long while. As it turned out, it was Dominic who had been causing all the chaos, having been summoned due to Duck's accident on the hill. Dominic was out for revenge, plain and simple. One night, a group of engines set out to find Dominic and put an end to the madness. Douglas stood up to Dominic, impressing Lily to the point of falling in love with him, but they'll come into play a lot later down the line. Dominic was scared away, his spirit disappearing for good, or so the engines thought. In December 1938, due to Peter having to be in the works for the next 6 months or so, due to the injuries that he had sustained in his accident, Geoffrey was brought back to Sodor to help with the LMS goods work. Geoffrey had been in Railgate and had become the reformed engine. He went to all the engines that he had wronged, apologising to them all. Geoffrey's return on Sodor, however, was met with apprehension at first, for shortly after he had arrived, a span of sabotages occurred. First, Thomas was sent onto the wrong line, and since the rails had been covered with oil from a nearby barrel, Thomas went straight into the water. The barrel had come from King Ori's Bridge, so a delegation of police officers went up the line to investigate. However, a sabotage on the MSR was achieved by tampering with the points just before Andreas came through with his passenger train. Luckily for the MSR, there were no serious injuries, but that couldn't be said for the next accident on Sodor. Late one day in mid-December 1938, two young boys, twin brothers Robert and Sean Creedy, would watch a train pulled by Douglas pass by on their way back from school. Their father, Michael Creedy, was the guard on board the train, a rostering that would end up impacting Sodor in unforeseen ways. Early the next morning, the Flying Kipper was cruising down the line, heading from Knapford to Manchester. Just outside of Kildane, however, the snow had forced the signal down, causing Henry to crash at near full speed into the back half of Donald's goods train, killing the guard Michael Creedy. His two sons, Robert and Sean, would be taken in by their uncle Gregory Hall, as their mother had killed herself due to the death of her husband, Mrs. Zorro being unable to help with the family and the house being foreclosed soon after. Gregory Hall would abuse both the boys, causing one of them to resent the railways that had killed his father, leading to a few major incidents, but that will be discussed a far lot later. The media outcry of the sabotage apparently being a murder, the mistress who was holding the saboteur gave him up, a Jacob Burke, as in Burke and Blair, the railway board investigators who were on Sodor back in 1938. Wow, okay, it's been about 6 whole pages of script since I started talking about 1938. It's really been a dense and packed year for Sodor, hasn't it? We are now officially in 1939, still another dense year for Sodor, but less dense than 1938. Due to Henry's accident involving the Flying Kipper, he was sent away to be repaired, and Winston from the former Furness Railway would be brought in to help with the goods work. A guard on Sodor, a man named Homer, maybe Homer Simpson, who knows, ran into a heaping lot of debt, so he was easily convinced to smuggle drugs onto Sodor via a goods train. Homer would be arrested and revealed that the drugs were on Gordon's train. Gordon would be taken in for questioning, momentarily arrested for a few hours while the investigations took place. Later that night, Gordon got back to the sheds just in time to hear Edward tell the others about the tales about how the Furness Railway closed in 1907. On the Skarloey Railway, the British Union of Fascists, or I shall now call them the British Union, had an incident with one of the station masters. One of the workers had used a derogatory term for David Becker, a Jewish man, the station master at Sudwin. The worker was fired because of this, but later that night, 4 men from the British Union attempted to beat up David, only to find out, really quickly, that he was a boxing champion. David was welcomed as a hero the next day on the Skarloey Railway. The attacks were frontline press, with the attackers denying that they were affiliated with the British Union at all, but the press did not believe so. The public outcry grew so severe that soon the British Union would leave Sodor, dissolving in 1940 for very obvious reasons. Due to the incident with the boulder back in 1938, Franks and Son Munitions would have to lay off a huge number of their staff, eventually downsizing and moving the operation to Krosnay-Kern on the Skarloey Railway. The SKR fleet undertook this operation with the usual complaints from Duncan. This relocation would be completed in March 1939. A few days later, Rheneas was taking a passenger train down the Skarloey Railway when his valve gear jammed. Due to the rain, one of the trees above Rheneas began to slip, so with great pain, Rheneas was able to back up, narrowly avoiding getting squashed and saving his passengers. A few days later, Percy would take Thomas's train for him, taking the Vicar's Sunday School to the beach and back. On the way back, however, a sudden storm rolled in, washing away some of the tracks just outside of Marston Heights. Percy was unable to stop in time, sliding into the very deep body of water. Diesel was nearby and teased Percy a lot about the incident. One day, the station master at Knapford, Willie Hanson, and the owner of the Sodor bus company, David Hanson, made a bet about who could get to Farquhar first, Thomas or Bertie. The race started right there, needless to say. The race caused most of the passengers to miss their stops, and Thomas and Bertie were caught speeding. Eric had allowed Thomas to pass him at Elsbridge on a red signal, violating the law about signals and blocks. A few days after this race, Mickey would find out about this, and would therefore contact Joey, and so in doing, Thomas and Bertie were arrested. The pair would get 10 days each in Railgate due to the various charges, with Eric getting 2 days home incarceration. Thomas and Bertie wouldn't be alone at Railgate, however, as Kate would pull a trick on Diesel, causing Diesel to derail at Marston Heights coal plant. Kate would therefore receive 6 days at Railgate. With the rising tensions in Europe, Sodor was called to defend itself, with 2 trains loaded with munitions and anti-aircraft guns arriving on Sodor. The first for the LNER pulled by Molly, intending to defend the west and northwest of Sodor. The second train, pulled by Peter, was intended to defend the south and east of Sodor. Eric and James were awestruck by the trains of armaments pulled by Molly, for different reasons. A new joint army-naval base was to be built on Sodor near Vickerstown, the construction being shared by the LNER and LMS. There was one minor incident when Diesel accidentally derailed a railgun, with James witnessing this. James would therefore tell the engines about what had happened to him and Amanda back on the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway back in 1917. Fort Sudrian would be opened on the 4th of July 1939, becoming a central point for docks and ships related to the Army and Navy. The 51st Vickerstown Regiment would also be based here, training regularly. Since Peter had returned to Sodor, Geoffrey was sent back to the mainland. Winston was due for his 5-year service, so Molly stayed on Sodor for the LNER to help with the goods work. One day, Gordon's whistle burst, letting out a very shrill whistling noise that couldn't be shut off for a good long while. It was only with the intervention of workmen, a ladder, and hammer was the noise finally gone. Eric and Molly's relationship began to blossom, with Diesel and Adam mocking Eric. One day, Molly tricked Adam and Diesel to take an empty train from Wellsworth to Barrow, allowing the opportunity for the LNER to swoop in and nab 2 lucrative contracts, thereby earning more money for the LNER. Lily had to explain to Gordon one day about how Douglas and her were a thing, rather than Gordon and Lily as a couple. Gordon had been outraged at first, but then heard the reasoning and mellowed out, apologising to Douglas the next day. On that same day, Henry arrived back to Sodor. Due to Henry's return, Molly and Winston would be sent back to the mainland. Every year, during the last week of August, Godred's Day, in celebration of King Godred MacHoward of Sodor, a weeks-long celebration is held to commemorate the special occasion. On the final day, a special engine parade is held, the specific date I'll refrain from saying just for a brief bit. Fort Sudrian acquired a new engine during this time, called Benson, who was with the ROD. Benson was a very bossy busybody, taking his authority as a military officer very seriously. The day before Godred's Day and the parade was due to take place, Kate hit a tree on the line and derailed on the main line, damaging some of the rails and sleepers. It was a tight race the next day to get the tracks fixed in time for the parade, but luckily it was able to go ahead. The parade went very successfully, with the night festivities culminating in fireworks. The LNER and LMS engines put aside their differences and enjoyed themselves this night. A good thing as well, as the day of Godred's Day would be August 31st. And considering we are in the year of 1939, I'm pretty sure you can tell what would happen the next day. Alright, wow, okay, that season was very packed, wasn't it? Covering 1938 and 1939. Victor has definitely got into his stride at this point, with pacing and the narration issues of the past being non-existent here. Honestly, a very great season, 9 out of 10. And so far, if you're looking at the episode ranking charts, this is what it looks like. Now, for the next part of the video, it does get extremely depressing, so you have been warned. On September 1st, 1939, Adolf Hitler invaded Poland with the assistance of the USSR and Stalin. On September 3rd, 1939, the UK and France declared war on Germany in return. The Second World War was about to begin, and not all the engines would survive. We have now reached the stories of war. The big four railway companies were unified into one big railway collective, the sole purpose being to supply munitions and raw materials to the front line to fight Hitler. Hitler had invaded Eastern Europe and then turned his sides onto Western Europe. On the day that France fell to Nazi Germany, Operation Chariot was put into effect, detailing the mass evacuation of civilians, mainly children, from the ports and big cities to places in the countryside, deemed less likely to be hit with German bomber attacks. Gordon, Reginald, James, and Donald had previously volunteered for the role of evacuations if Operation Chariot was put into effect, and so in June 1940, these four engines would be called upon to implement this. After a few weeks of non-stop evacuation trains, one such incident would affect the engines deeply. Ellis had burst his safety valve outside of High Bridge, and due to the size of the train, Gordon was the only one capable of pulling such a train. Not long after he left, the Germans launched a lightning plane attack on High Bridge. Gordon saw a tunnel coming and dashed inside of it. However, the back half of his train had become uncoupled, being exploded by a German bomb outside of the tunnel. 157 people died during the attack on High Bridge, 84 of whom had been on Gordon's train. On the mainland in 1941, at the town of Lofel, the Luftwaffe attacked, exploding the engine shed. The fire was getting closer to the fully laden oil train nearby, so with extreme bravery from Albert and his crew, they got the train out of there. A good thing too, as the yard office nearby had been filled with civilians hiding from the Luftwaffe attack. 30 people died on the attack on Lofel, but it would have been much worse if Albert hadn't got the oil train out of the way. Back on Sodor, a man from one of the northern towns of Sodor, Horace Fletcher, would die out at sea. Sodor would not escape the wrath of the Nazis, as one night the Luftwaffe attacked many places across Sodor at once. Henry would hide in the tunnel between Knapford and Lower Knapford, giving it the name that we all know it as today. At Knapford Station, a fully laden train of munitions was just outside the station. Colin heroically grabbed the train and ran from the station, sacrificing himself to save Diesel, Thomas, Toby, and the town of Knapford. More than 100 people died in the attack, but it could have easily been triple if the munitions train exploded. Rest in peace, Colin, 1885 to 1941, age 56. On the same night as the Blitz, Horace Fletcher's wife, Matilda, would be in her home when a bomb would strike the house, killing her instantly. This small bit about the Fletchers will become relevant towards the end of the video. Reginald, Gordon, Donald, and James were called back to Sodor to help with the repairs. At the end of 1941, the USA would be called into the war because of Pearl Harbor. Due to the help of the Americans, they began to ship engines to the UK to help with the war effort, one of these engines being Rosie, who worked at Fort Sudrian. Benson was reassigned to the Brenham docks. In 1942, the military campaign in North Africa was heating up, so much so that some of the engines were asked to go to fight the war. Thomas, Edward, Henry, Gordon, Adam, Lily, Peter, and Douglas all volunteered to fight. The group were given inbuilt radios, taught the ancient Sudric language to disguise radio communications, and were inducted into the 110th Platoon of the Steam Corps, otherwise known as the Wild Nor'Westers. Edward was given charge of the Wild Nor'Westers. While in North Africa, the Wild Nor'Westers were attacked by many German engines painted with faces designed to intimidate the enemy, which was kind of a little bit weird, but anyways, let's continue. The Wild Nor'Westers were able to repel the German engines, making use of the railguns that had been brought with them to Africa. In 1943, espionage and sabotage were found aplenty on the front line. Peter was almost killed when the bridge he was expected to cross was blown up in front of him. The lucky lamp, which had somehow come with the Wild Nor'Westers, had split Peter's train, causing him to stop before he got to said bridge, saving his life. Of course, with the lucky lamp away from the MSR, they would suffer a few incidents. The British Union was still operating, albeit in a far smaller capacity, but that wouldn't stop them from implementing their own espionage tactics. One of the men, Gus, would cause a great deal of damage on Sodor. Back on Sodor, Alfred and Geoffrey had been called in to fill the vacant spaces left by the engines of the Wild Nor'Westers. The peers still hated each other over the events that took place in 1935 back in London. Elsbridge's station master, Alexander Jeffreys, would be killed by the way of poisoning by Bobby, an associate of the British Union, who died while in an argument with Toby. With Jeffreys out of the way, a greater plan to target Sodor was made once again. Gus and Bobby would place a bomb into a train that was due for Knapford Harbour, with enough explosives to destroy a sizable portion of the docks. A workman, however, decided to check the vans randomly, discovering the bomb. Alfred was nearby, so he ran into the train and charged as far away from Knapford as he could. Unfortunately, James was passing the other way, with Mr. Starr riding in the brake van. The train passed James, but the bomb went off in front of Alfred, and next to that brake van. Alfred, the guard, and Mr. Starr were all killed by the explosion. Mr. Zorro was put in charge of Sodor's railways as a result. Rest in peace Alfred, 1911 to 1943, age 32, and rest in peace Jonathan Starr, 1887 to 1943, age 56. The British Union would be disbanded once and for all, as with the arrest of Bobby and Gus, they gave up the whereabouts of the British Union, and when it was found that they were being bankrolled by the German SS, most of its members were sentenced to execution or life in prison. The Wild Nor'westers had succeeded in Africa and were being sent to the front line in Germany in 1944, moving ever so close to Berlin. One day in 1945, Thomas and Douglas were taking a train to Heldenbergen when a sudden attack by the Germans caused them to be stuck behind enemy lines. While behind enemy lines, Thomas and Douglas came across Oliver, Toad, and Blair, as in Burke and Blair, at an abandoned factory. Toad had been converted into a radio tapper, trying to locate the whereabouts of Joseph Mengele, one of the most disgusting people ever imaginable, who experimented on people in concentration camps. And those experiments I cannot discuss here. Heldenbergen was taken back by the Wild Nor'westers, allowing for Thomas, Douglas, Oliver, Toad, and Blair to escape back to the Allied forces. While the town was being cleared, an unexploded round of ammunition was discovered. Henry tried to escape, but his safety valve went off. Lily would then sacrifice herself to save Henry, killing herself in the process. Rest in peace Lily, 1883 to 1945, age 62. A few days after Lily's death, Peter was taking a train to another town when the hospital of said town was taken captive by the Nazis, with civilians being trapped in the basement. Peter, however, saw the fact that the hospital was key to the Allied offensive, and the fact that the Nazis outweighed the civilians by 2 to 1. Peter fired a shell that would ultimately change his life, but that is for a discussion for a lot later. Word of Joseph Mengele's whereabouts stated that he might have been at Bolbrook concentration camp, so the Wild Nor'westers liberated the camp. However, Mengele escaped. Adam went to go check in one of the sheds, finding sights that I really do not want to describe. I'm pretty sure your brain, if you've seen the episode, I'm pretty sure you can figure out what he may have seen. Edward would also look in the same shed. Following the traumatic experience that they witnessed, the Wild Nor'westers were transferred to Ostend in Belgium. While in Ostend, a mistake allowed for a coach full of German POWs to enter the yard. Adam offered to shunt it onto a train going back to Germany, but instead he full speed shunted it into the sea, drowning all the men inside the coach. Due to this incident, the 110th Platoon of the Steam Corps was disbanded, and the engines were sent back to Europe. The Second World War would end on May 8, 1945 in Europe, and on September 2nd, 1945 in the Pacific. Wow, that again was very dense and was very depressing. Losing Colin, Alfred, Mr. Starr, and Lily, this is due to cause quite a few changes to this series as we go on. Stories of War is probably the best content Victor Tanzig will produce for a good while. I give it a solid 9.5 out of 10. We are now on to Season 3 with a broader sense of years, but no less impactful to the overall plot of the series. The Reverend Wilbert Awdry would publish the first book of the Railway series, somewhat adapting real events. This book released in 1945. 6 months after the Wild Nor'westers returned home, Edward was seeing Mickey about the nightmares that he was having after looking in the shed at Bolbrook. Adam had no remorse for his actions, and so was refusing to have the therapy sessions with Mickey. Since the war had left many people homeless, a wave of immigrants across the UK happened, finding jobs and starting lives again. Radek Zelenka would be one of these immigrants, originating from Czechoslovakia. He found work on the MSR, establishing himself as a very hard worker. We have now reached 1946, where structural reforms to rebuild Britain's railways were undertaken, the results of which would become finalised in 1948, aiming to nationalise the railways networks and the coal mines of the UK. In May 1946, Adam would be confronted by Radek over the drowning of the German POWs, as one of them had been his brother. Adam was heartbroken over this news, only finding solace once he found out that Radek's brother had technically deserved to die, for he had swindled many Czechs and Jewish people out of their fortunes during the war for his own personal gain. At Brendan Sheds that night, the LMS crew were informed that with the absence of Colin and Lily, replacements will be brought in to help with the increasing workload. And so, in June 1946, the 2 new engines arrived. For this new established joint railway between the LNER and LMS, the old nicknames and companies being unified into a temporary one. Pickett and Samantha would be the names of the engines brought to Sodor. Some fuel tankers had had their maintenance delayed for some time, and one day when Henry was pulling the train, one of the brake blocks locked on, causing a spark and starting a fire under one of the tankers. Gordon was due to pass through, so a quick finger from Pickett, who had been passing through some milk tankers, Pickett was able to extinguish the fire with the milk. Mr. Zora would suffer from a very nasty cough, usually disappearing for a few days at a time with sickness. It was only after a doctor's visit that he found that he was diagnosed with lung cancer, requiring chemotherapy treatment. In his place, Basil Corbett was appointed temporary manager of Sodor's Railways. The Indians were not happy with the news of Basil Corbett's news of being temporary controller, for he was notoriously a penny pinch, being the one that had actually proposed Toby to be sold to Burke and Blair for scrap back during the pair's visit in 1938. The race for head control of Sodor's Railways would heat up as Giles Freeman would put his hat into the ring. Leaks about contracts and such would become public, causing Sodor's Railways to lose some contracts to the ever-increasing road competition. The engines suspected Giles, but nothing could ever be proven. James would crash into the rear half of Henry's goods train, just outside of Maron, due to the forgetfulness of Maron's signalman. The fallout from this incident would be noticeable, as the public fallout caused Basil to cut passenger trains and other services to stay afloat, which therefore in turn lost even more contracts to the road. A few weeks later, James would still be in the works, with the money for the repairs being very much delayed by Basil. A trick played on Samantha by Diesel about backing signals caused Samantha to derail at Lower Sudbury. The public image of Sodor's Railways deteriorated even further. The head controller for Sodor's Railways was therefore decided, being a very unlikely candidate. You may have heard of him. He was Sir Topham Hatt. The reasons for his arrival to Sodor were very interesting indeed. Basically, what had happened was that Topham had somewhat hinted at blackmail, only for this information to be leaked to the press. Following this, he had made his way to Sodor, where he would then become the controller by a landslide. This episode was initially my least favourite, but I found a new least favourite later on in the show. Due to politics in London, the Sodor Council would be created in 1946. The capital city of Sodor was decided to be Vickerstown, as that was the main entry point to Sodor. Sir Topham had received funding from the Sodor Council to build the Vickerstown station and Vickerstown sheds, this project going on from roughly September 1946 to April 1947, and once the project was complete, a reshuffle was instituted. Basically, this reshuffle meant that the engines built for certain tasks, i.e. express, heavy goods, mixed goods, etc., will be permanently assigned to those roles, as in the past it was sort of a whatever engine was available had to do the job, which led to general chaos. However, this structure had some teething problems, as priority for fuel trains caused other trains to be delayed, causing a flow-on effect. The railway series was gaining massive popularity around this time. However, some events happened on Sodor because of these bugs. Henry would tell Samantha about the real story of Henry's Tunnel and how he hid in the tunnel to avoid the whir of the Nazi planes. Due to the influx of tourists to Sodor following the success of the railway series, the Sodor Council began to earn a lot of revenue, investing it back into the Elsbridge Airport, which will be discussed properly later in this video. Adam and Percy would get into an argument, leading to Percy accidentally coming off the rails at a set of faulty points because he was distracted. The general sentiment was that the LMS crew had seemed to be painted in a good light, being the ones that always came up on top, but there was no representation at all of the LMS in the books. The engines were getting so annoyed at the books being so fictionalized that Wilbur Audrey had to come back to Sodor to appease the engines, explaining that the books were just that, fiction. The books were designed to be for children, and so some character arcs and events were made up to appeal to younger readers, as some of the real truths would be very depressing for kids, especially considering the fact that World War II had just barely finished. Side note, there is a reference to the fact that the events of A Close Shave were 100% accurate in the books, but this of course was changed later down the line to be around the events involving Edward and Brian in 1915, so the reference at the end of this episode to A Close Shave was in fact not fully correct, but that's besides the point. Back on the mainland, WIF was becoming more and more expensive to maintain, eventually being given the three options offered to an engine: Heritage Line, being sold to another railway, or death by black water, a chemical compound able to permanently put an engine to sleep. WIF chose the fourth option, which will be discussed just a little bit later. WIF came back to Sodor to say his final goodbyes, fortunately being able to save Rosie, who was teetering on the edge after she derailed just outside of Crosby. WIF was able to hold Rosie in place until Mickey was able to arrive. It was revealed by WIF that he had signed up for target practice, as since he had been owned by the military, he decided to be of one last use for king and country. WIF gave his final goodbyes, being towed out to sea on a barge. On the Farquhar branch, they desperately needed another engine to help with the fuel deliveries to Marston Heights. At this very moment, all the engines then realised what needed to be done. The timing was incredibly close, as with a quick phone call and an intervention by 10 cents, WIF was saved. However, due to a partial communications breakdown, it had appeared that WIF had been killed by a live round. and so in doing he decided to surprise the engines roughly 10 hours after he was saved. Whiff was permanently assigned to the Far Cry branch line. December 1947 would be especially busy as the businesses of Sodor rushed to send out their stock before the ports closed due to the snow. Jeffrey was brought back to Sodor once again to help with the workload. Due to visions from Alfred and a weird shared dream into the Beyond realm, Alfred and Jeffrey were able to reconcile their differences, with Alfred mentioning that Colin, Lily, and Mr. Starr sent their regards. Henry and Douglas had always had animosity surrounding the death of Lily, as she had died to save Henry. Following a few misplaced words from Henry, Douglas rammed Henry right off the tracks. Needless to say, this was the boiling point of a several-year feud. So Topham Hatt would instigate an emergency meeting for the pair, getting them to resolve their differences around the fact that Lily had indeed died a hero, and would have sacrificed herself for any of the other engines. Douglas realised the error of his ways, apologising to Henry. A good thing as well, as just a few weeks later, a very major event in railway history would unfold. But that is a story for another day. Okay, so, as you guessed from the title of this video, this is indeed a part 1, and I think it would be suitable to call it here, because we've seen the formation of Sodor and the railways on the island up until the formation of British Railways. Trust me folks, the content gets deep from here on, and frankly will work better as a part 2. So yeah, make sure to like, share, subscribe, comment, do the things that YouTube tells me to tell you. I'll see you next time folks, goodbye.